Redox reactions are among the most important concepts in chemistry. It is a huge topic that covers things from combustion reactions, photosynthesis, cellular respiration, which is stuff we're going to talk about this unit, but it also includes acid-base reactions or how batteries work, all kinds of different things. And so it would be very easy for me to get carried away on this topic. Therefore, I am going to attempt to be restrained and only give you the information that you will require in order to get through the rest of this unit. So this is just going to be skimming the surface. If you are taking a chemistry course, this will not suffice. But otherwise, here we go. Simplified redox reactions. Redox reactions involve the transfer of electrons from one atom to another during bond formation or bond breaking. So you might get the sense, ooh, that sounds kind of like ionic bonds, where there's an electron transferred from one atom to another. But actually it could include covalent bonds too. You might remember that in a water molecule, for instance, that the oxygen and the hydrogens share electrons, but they don't share them equally, right? The oxygen pulls on that electron a little bit harder. Sometimes it pulls on it so hard, in fact, that it just steals it altogether and that hydrogen pops off, and then the OH is kind of floats off with it. So you get a hydroxide anion floating around in the water there. So in either of these situations, either when a bond is formed where an atom like these hydrogens that had full custody of their electron, but now they don't have it, they've lost a little bit of that electron, or they have it just completely stripped from them. In both of those situations, we say that those atoms, the hydrogens, have become oxidized. Oxidation is what oxygen tends to do to other atoms because it is so greedy for electrons. So oxidation is losing electrons. It's losing total custody of an electron or partial custody of an electron through bonding. Now, I mentioned in the Properties of Water video, I think, that the reason why oxygen does this is because it has a property called electronegativity. Oxygen has a high electronegativity. It pulls on electrons. It's greedy for electrons. And hydrogen has a low electronegativity. It tends to give them up. In fact, hydrogen is the least electronegative element in existence. So, whenever hydrogen is involved in any kind of bond, it tends to lose its electrons. And if you gain an electron, so losing an electron is called being oxidized, gaining an electron, what happens to the oxygen here, is called being reduced. Kind of like you can imagine gaining a negative, right? So adding a negative is like subtracting, so gaining an electron is called being reduced. So that means that pretty much anytime you add a hydrogen to something, chances are you are reducing that thing. And in biology, that's typically how we think about redox reactions, is in terms of gaining and losing hydrogens. But that's just a proxy for following electrons through these equations. Let me go over that so that it's clear before we move on to the next slide. Whenever any kind of bond, ionic or covalent, is formed, if an atom fully loses custody of an electron in an ionic bond or partially loses custody of an electron in a covalent bond, we say that that atom is oxidized. If it gains an electron, fully or partially, then it is reduced. Okay? Oxidation is losing, reduction is gaining. Next important concept to understand. Electrons can be at different energy levels. So if, for example, we were talking about photosynthesis, one concept that you're going to need to understand is that sometimes a photon can hit an electron and that will charge up that electron. It'll make it excited and it'll bump it up into a higher energy level. And high energy electrons are easier to pass from one atom to another. So not only are we going to be following the trail of an electron from one bond to another bond to another bond as it goes through a metabolic pathway, we're actually going to be following the path of a high energy electron, a particular electron of interest. And that high energy electron is interesting because All of this, photosynthesis and cellular respiration, is about powering cellular work. So it's the high energy stuff that we are interested in. We're going to make some compounds with a lot of stored energy inside of them. So it's going to be all about transferring that energy around and putting it into different forms. So there's some important things to note on this slide. High energy electrons are often passed from one molecule to another by transferring a hydrogen. Remember I said that whenever you add a hydrogen to something, you're reducing that thing. So if you pass a hydrogen from one molecule to another molecule, the first molecule that loses the hydrogen is being oxidized, and the one that receives it is being reduced. That hydrogen is carrying the high energy electron. So sometimes in these equations, you'll notice that we're following an electron, and then other times you'll notice that we are following a hydrogen, but they're both proxies for the same thing. In both cases, we are following the energy in the system. Typically, in biological systems, when a compound is reduced, we are storing energy. So a reduced compound is a high energy compound, and when it's oxidized, it releases energy. Okay, so an oxidized compound is going to release energy. Like fire, combustion is an oxidation reaction. All of the stored chemical energy is being oxidized and it's being released as heat and light through this redox reaction. Oxidation doesn't necessarily require oxygen, but in the case of combustion and indeed cellular respiration, it does, so that's convenient. On the next slide, you can see an example of the kind of reactions I'm talking about. We have lactate, which has some stored chemical energy inside of it, and we have a dinucleotide coenzyme called NAD+. We'll see NAD+ in cellular respiration when we get to those slides. We'll see similar things like NADP+ coming up very shortly in photosynthesis, and other dinucleotides as well. ATP is another nucleotide coenzyme that's an energy carrier. All of these are energy carriers for metabolism, so be familiar with some of these abbreviations. You'll be seeing them over and over and over again. But we're going to transfer the energy from lactate over to this coenzyme because the coenzymes, NAD+ and NADP+, are going to be accepted by the cell's energy processing machinery much more readily than, say, lactate would be, right? So what we're going to do is a reduction reaction, an oxidation reduction reaction, a redox reaction. And of course, this requires an enzyme. We need proteins to do everything inside the cell. So we need lactate dehydrogenase, ASE. It's an enzyme. And what does it do? It dehydrogenases. It removes hydrogens from what? Lactate. So this is a remove hydrogen from lactate enzyme. I love the way we name enzymes. It just tells you everything about the molecule right away. And what does that give us? It gives us pyruvate, which can then enter the mitochondrion, and in the process of giving us pyruvate, it gives us NADH. Look at this, we get an NADH molecule. You don't know about NADH yet, but when we get to cellular respiration, these are going to be a big deal. So, what's happened here? Lactate has been oxidized in this equation. It's been oxidized to pyruvate. NAD+ has been reduced to form NADH. NADH is the high energy form of this coenzyme, right? So if you see the plus, it's low energy. It's like a dead battery, but NADH is the reduced version, high energy, charged up battery. That H is a hydrogen, but that hydrogen is a proxy for a high energy electron that's carrying around there, as we discussed before. So NADH has been reduced, lactate has been oxidized in this scenario. Now this oil rig, this is something you will learn in any given chemistry class. Oil rig is oxidation is losing, reduction is gaining. All right, so that's just a way to remember, a mnemonic for remembering which term is which. Now, usually you're thinking about electrons when you're talking about oxidation reduction reactions, and we are too, but in most biological equations, we're really just looking at the hydrogens here, and it works just the same. Oxidation is losing. Which molecule lost hydrogens? Lactate did, and lactate was oxidized, so oxidation is losing. reduction is gaining. Which molecule gained hydrogens? NADH did, or NAD did. So it was reduced. Reduction is gaining hydrogens. So it works just as well for hydrogens as it does for electrons. Now, why am I talking about redox reactions in the first place? Well, because we're about to talk about photosynthesis and cellular respiration, which are big redox reactions, each of which is made up of dozens of smaller redox reactions. So you need to know a little bit about that. If you take a look at the super simplified equation for photosynthesis, where you take 6 CO2 and 6 H2O and sunlight, and then you get a C6H12O6 and 6O2, well, if we take a look at the carbon in the initial state, it had no hydrogens attached to it, and then in the final state, it has all of these hydrogens attached to it. So carbon is reduced because it gains hydrogen. Reduction is gaining in photosynthesis. Oxygen is actually oxidized. Look at that. We take a whole bunch of oxygen and we free it from those hydrogens. We split it off from those hydrogens and we send it out as O2. So oxygen is oxidized in photosynthesis. And that is unusual. Oxygen is almost never oxidized in biological reactions. That's part of the power of photosynthesis, is that oxygen is oxidized in the process. And we'll see how that's done. Really in the very first step of photosynthesis is where that happens. Cellular respiration, we have C6H12O6. It's basically the mirror image. It's the complete opposite chemical reaction. It starts with the carbons being attached to hydrogens, but they lose hydrogens. Oxidation is losing, so they become CO2s, so carbon is oxidized, but oxygen is reduced. Oxygen's reduced to form water. So they are mirror image reactions in multiple ways. One, the entire equation is just flipped backwards in both cases. You get energy in photosynthesis, energy out in the form of ATP in cellular respiration. Photosynthesis is a kind of anabolism, which we talked about in one of the previous videos. Cellular respiration is a kind of catabolism. Photosynthesis, carbon is reduced, oxygen is oxidized. Cellular respiration, carbon is oxidized, oxygen is reduced. So in the next video, we're going to start with the photosynthesis content.